A barbaric regime with no respect for human rights. Well, that's how the UK's Prime Minister has described Iran for the execution of a former top defence official and a dual British-Iranian citizen found guilty of spying for UK intelligence. London has responded by imposing sanctions on the Islamic Republic's Attorney General.
I'm appalled by the execution of British-Iranian citizen Ali Reza Akbari in Iran. This was a callous and cowardly act carried out by a barbaric regime with no respect for the human rights of their own people.
Ali Reza Akbari was accused of passing classified defence and security information to the British intelligence services, as well as receiving nearly $2 million in compensation. He had confessed, but later denied the allegations, saying they were given under duress. Ali Reza Akbari had risen to be a high-ranking Iranian official, and he also fought for the country during the Iran-Iraq war. Back in 2008, he was freed by an Iranian court as no evidence was presented. He then moved to Britain, where he received British citizenship. 10 years later, he was rearrested during a visit to Teheran and later found guilty of treason and executed. Well, let's discuss this with Syed Mohammad Marandi, University of Tehran, and joining us from Iran itself. Thanks for joining us now, Professor Marandi. Now, what's your take on the British reaction to the execution of this joint Iranian-British national?
It's expected. After all, he was caught working for the UK. The evidence is quite clear. And I think the most blatant problem that the UK faces here is how in the world did a former deputy Iranian defense minister gain British citizenship? When the Iranian military and so many Iranian senior officials and past officials are sanctioned, how in the world did he gain citizenship? Forget the fact that he received residency. He became a British citizen. The fact is that in Western countries, whenever the Iranians arrest a spy, whenever they capture someone working for Western intelligence, Western media will all say that the person is innocent. So we can safely assume that Western countries do not carry out espionage in non-Western countries. They are completely innocent. They're completely benign. But of course, I think the reality on the ground and history shows that the exact opposite is true.
Well, obviously, Ali Reza Akbari, he himself said he was innocent and that the confession he gave was after being tortured. Now, does the fact that he is a British citizen not somewhat complicate the matter in that a British citizen was executed?
Well, he was a person who was involved in many senior bodies in Iran, and there's no doubt that he passed on information to the British. The fact that the Western media covers the story in a way in which benefits their own narrative is understandable. In Iran, if there are riots, they'll call them peaceful protesters. If a police officer is burned alive, they will not allude to that. They will not mention it. If the rioters knife and slit people's throats, there will be a complete silence. In the riots that we had a couple of months ago in Iran, we had over 60 police officers murdered. And imagine if it was the United States, if you multiply it by 4, because the United States is roughly 4 times as the population is 4 times greater than Iran, that would be like 250, 60, 70 police officers. If you had that many U.S. police officers murdered during a period of a few weeks, what would the response be in the United States? What would the response be in the UK? So these double standards are understandable because that's how the West functions. They support ISIS in Syria for years, and then they called them freedom fighters. And then when ISIS began to grow too large, or when the Iranians and their allies were defeating ISIS, suddenly they pretended that they were the real fighters against ISIS. Even in your own conflict with Ukraine, NATO advances on eastwards towards the Russian border, lying to the Russians. They bring about a coup. Then the right-wing government in Kiev suppresses the Russians, but everything is the fault of the Russians. This is the traditional Western narrative in any conflict.
Well, I think you've touched on my next question, actually, Professor Marandi. Now, obviously, Iran isn't the only country to have the death penalty. And think about it what you will, whether you agree with it or not. Do you think the reaction of the UK, the Europe and their allies is different when it comes to executions in Iran as compared to, for example, executions in America?
That is only one small, very, very small part of the hypocrisy. You're absolutely correct. But the real hypocrisy is that Persian media in the UK has, during the riots that we had a few weeks ago, were calling on the protesters to kill the police. I've tweeted a couple of these clips where they were legitimizing and supporting burning police officers alive, knifing them and killing them, torturing them. In the UK, if this was done in English, if these media outlets were in the English language or directed towards a Western audience, they would be shut down in minutes and they would be put on trial for doing this. But when it comes to Iran, it's allowed. So killing Iranian police officers is fine, but executing someone who carries out espionage is barbaric. Supporting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups in Afghanistan, in Syria and Iraq, destroying Libya and Iraq, imposing brutal sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba, and the genocide in Yemen, these are infinitely worse than any execution, whether one accepts capital punishment or not. But in the Western world, all of that is erased because they do it, and their adversaries are condemned simply because they want to be independent.
Indeed. Well, Syed Mohammed Marandi, University of Tehran professor, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you. We're sure we'll speak to you soon on the programme. Thank you.